there are waves of feminism. Okay, so what that means is over time, what feminists want have changed. So there are four historic waves of feminism. Okay, so if you think about the first wave of feminism, that would be probably most of you guys are familiar with this. The first wave of feminism would have been the era of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention. So if you think about first wave feminism, that's that period. All right, but we're getting ready to look at what's called second wave feminism. Okay, so after the Civil War, the issue shifted for a lot of women. Historically, the issue had been primarily in the first wave of feminism, gaining rights over their independence as citizens. So try to think of it as being equal to a man in terms of you as rights as an individual. These were often women who challenged the cult of domesticity, right? Well, they're going to continue. This first wave feminism is going to continue into the period following the Civil War. And that's where you see what's called second wave feminism in the 20th century. So these are still first wave feminists. All right. It'll be after. So the kind of pinnacle for their success is going to come with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So what happened in 1920 in the 19th Amendment? Women's suffrage. So if you think from Seneca Falls, 1848, to 1919, is pretty much the dominant focus for women was to gain rights, including the rights of citizens and their rights to vote, right? Well, they're not there yet. And so after the Civil War, women were particularly upset about the absence of equality under the 14th Amendment, where male is mentioned, and under the 15th Amendment, where gender or sex is not. Now, another figure who doesn't make it in the textbook, which I think is a gross omission, is Helen Keller. Now, Helen Keller is one of these figures in history where if you were to ask even a small child, they usually know who she is. They usually recognize the name Helen Keller. They're like, oh, yeah, the blind and deaf lady, right? And you're like, yeah, sure. Okay, except they usually associate her as an angry child who learned to communicate through an effective speech therapist, right? And that's usually all anybody's ever heard of. What they fail to understand is that once she gained her so-called voice, what did she have to say? And the thing is Helen Keller was a radical socialist. And Americans don't like to hear that part of the story. Like in other words, we have 13 years of Helen Keller as a kid. And then we have 70 years of Helen Keller as an adult. So what did she do as an adult? Well, here she is. So she went to college. Okay. She helped found the American Civil Liberties Union, which is one of the most liberal groups in American history. She went to over 40 countries, and her primary focus was on people with disabilities and women's rights. And she believed that the best way to get these was through socialism. Now, a good example, you guys know what, have you ever heard like cognitive bias? Like a bias in your thinking process? How about cognitive dissonance? So here's an example of cognitive dissonance. Helen Keller for years was lifted up, particularly after she graduated from Radcliffe, by newspapers and journalists, right? And one of the most famous was a newspaper called the Brooklyn Eagle. And here it says, at the time, compliments were, this editor at the Brooklyn Eagle, he paid me were generous. So in other words, look at Helen Keller, how extraordinary it is. She's overcome these terrible adversity and succeeded in spite of it, right? Great story. But then as soon as she comes out for socialism, he reminds the public that she's blind and deaf and liable to error. I must have shrunk in intelligence during the years since I met this editor. Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle. They're socially blind and deaf. They defend an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the blindness and deafness which we're trying to prevent. Helen Keller discovered that the leading cause of blindness in America was industrial accidents. Okay. The second leading cause of blindness in America was syphilis amongst prostitutes. And so she realized that these are things that could be prevented. Blindness could be prevented if we begin to focus on it. And so she's going to become a great advocate, particularly for women's rights, as well as for the rights of the disabled. And so here's another example. In 1911, Helen Keller says, I was appointed to investigate the conditions of the blind. But for the first time, I, who had thought blindness was a misfortune, found that it was traceable to industrial conditions caused by greed and selfishness. I found that poverty drove women to a life of shame. That's prostitution. That ended in blindness. The few own the many because they possess the means of livelihood of all. The country is governed for the richest, for the corporations, bankers, land speculators, and exploiters of labor. Majority of mankind are working people. So long as their demands, the ownership and control of their livelihoods, are set at naught, we can neither have men's rights nor women's rights. Majority of mankind is ground down by industrial oppression. That's Helen Keller. So, you know, I'm not saying socialism is the solution, but I'm saying that Helen Keller did. And she was famous and people read her works. And Helen Keller was certainly well received for a long time until she became really associated with that. And then also by World War I, she had even donated money to the American Communist Party. So Helen Keller was a radical reformer of the late 19th century, as was this lady, Margaret Sanger. Now, at the time, she was considered a radical reformer. Today, women, particularly feminist groups, lift her up as a leading figure of reform in their history. But Margaret Sanger was noticing that one of the major problems of the American immigrant population, particularly, was unwanted pregnancies. Unwanted pregnancies, particularly amongst Catholic women. The Catholic Church prohibited the use of contraception, which is like birth control. And so she began to publicly teach American women about birth control. And birth control was a taboo. You weren't supposed to talk about it. You know, women weren't supposed to have it, use it. There was only one reason to have sexual relations. That was to have children, right? So why would you need birth control? And that was kind of the attitude of lawmakers. And it was against the law to discuss birth control. That's why, you know, you'll see her get arrested. And so ultimately, she's going to create an organization called Planned Parenthood. Now, people are certainly familiar with it today. Planned Parenthood. At the time, she was not an abortion advocate. However, abortion was something that she believed was a right for women to have. And so she did advocate for women to have abortion rights as a birth control advocate. So if you consider that, that's pretty radical in the early 20th century, the late 19th century. But her success was the long-term success of both birth control movement and ultimately of the woman's right to choose advocacy. So Margaret Sanger is a key feminist of this period and a key advocate, particularly for immigrants to begin having control over their body, particularly women. Now, another key pair of women who are often overlooked. So what happens, and you definitely want to write these down or make note of them, is that in this organization called NALSA, so I would mention the fact that there were several groups of, not several, but there were several key women reformers. So I mentioned like Helen Keller, okay, Margaret Sanger. But by far the two most significant politically were these two women here that you see in this picture. Dr. Anna Shaw, okay, and Carrie Catt. That's these two ladies here, Anna Shaw and Carrie Catt. You can see they were standing together and they formed a group called NALSA. NAWSA. Okay, so if you're reading about women's suffrage, you'll read that it started out as a couple different groups, okay? The American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage. The National Women's Suffrage Association was started by Susan B. Anthony. You can see her right here. To her right is Carrie Catt. That's Carrie Catt beside Susan B. Anthony. So here's Susan B. All right, and Carrie Catt. And so they merged the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. All right. And so definitely be familiar with NALSA. And they were the leading group and ultimately the successful group that championed women's right to vote. Now, at the time, particularly with Carrie Catt, and that's her argument, is that they're saying we're not equal to men. They weren't arguing that, they certainly believed that, but they didn't argue that. In other words, they weren't claiming gender equality. They knew that in a society that was male dominated like America, that was not going to fly. But what they did argue is that for a century, you have been saying women are the sort of queen of the household. You remember the cult of domesticity? Yeah. Remember Republican motherhood before it? So for a century, women have had this elevated role in society, the gatekeepers of the nation's moral conscience. And yet you don't let us vote. Where best can we serve the nation's moral conscience, particularly in an urban environment, but through voting for improvements? So her advocacy is not through challenging gender roles like Victoria Woodhull did. Victoria Woodhull was totally challenging gender roles. roles. Okay. But rather, she is advocating for traditional women's roles should be expanded to include suffrage. Okay. So no Carrie Catt. Definitely be familiar with her. Also be familiar, and you can see it mentioned here. You had Dr. Shaw, and this is kind of another similarity about these middle-class reform women, was that they were usually in multiple groups because they had multiple issues. And the group that she belonged to was founded by the most powerful women's group in the country, and that's the WCTU. So most of these women were, of course, suffragettes as well. But you definitely need to know who Frances Willard is, because Willard was the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Okay. And that group is the group that's going to ultimately get the 18th Amendment ratified. So the WCTU is the one that is going to secure prohibition. All right. So a lot of feminists at this period were advocates for reform for all kinds of issues, just like the beginning of first wave feminism were advocates for reform. All right. So I would definitely be familiar with the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. Okay. And she was its presiding figure for 20 years. Some consider her the most powerful woman in America. Now, I didn't include in my PowerPoint, and I certainly should. There's a video of it on my YouTube list, my playlist. But I would like you to be familiar with the landmark role of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Okay, Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an extraordinarily effective writer who I believe some of you have actually read. Yeah, so if you've read The Yellow Wallpaper, you may recall it's a story about a lady who is, I believe, if memory serves, she's pregnant, or she's had a baby, and she's having what we would call today postpartum depression. And what Gilman argued was that when women have children, they basically are sacrificing the rest of their life. You understand? Like, they can't have a career, they can't have a profession. And the way that pregnancy was treated and sort of solved, it was this bizarre, almost like isolation treatment, right? Like, it was like being put in, if I remember, you guys, if you've read it, should certainly remind me, but it's like being in solitary confinement. And if I remember the character correctly, she basically goes nuts and starts peeling the wallpaper off the wall, right? And, you know, it's a part of this sort of patriarchal, I don't know what the best word to use for it would be, but sort of male-dominated society that really drives, you know, in this case, women insane, which is, I think, pretty cool story. So anyway, I'll work on that PowerPoint. For some reason, my slide does not include Charlotte Perkins Gilman, but I want you to also know and be familiar with her other key work. So I'll see if I can't pull that up. Give me just a second, and I'll grab a couple different things here. So really, really influential writer, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And like I said, some of you guys have read it. So, by the way, one of the things I like about some of these reformers, like Gilman, is that she actually proposes some solutions. So one of her proposals is she's taking a look at the role of women, at life during this period, and the relationship between men and women. And she's saying that society is sort of set up to trap women. And so there needs to be some social changes to kind of make life better for work, so that women can both be mothers and work. And that's really pretty radical at the time, because once you had children, you were pretty much not expected to work, which was for these immigrant women virtually impossible. And I've seen this in this year, particularly one of the saddest things about this year is that what she's writing about is about women not being able to have a job. It's kind of what's happened across the country, where a lot of women who had to give up their work to stay home with their kids. And I've really hated that that's true. Like, because the last group to make real progress in work is women, and then they're the first group that are having to like just go back home and, you know, kind of be with the kids during the pandemic. And so she had some solutions for that, and you might want to write these down. One of which would be sort of like communal or governmental run centralized nurseries. So rather than like daycare, basically. So she foreshadows, because it doesn't happen then, but it will come. And of course, the settlement houses certainly do this, but she sort of I guess predicts is probably the best word. She predicts the need for daycare centers. And in some ways, this is really interesting too, and fast food. Now, she doesn't, she's not franchising McDonald's or anything here, but she believed that women who worked needed a communal kitchen to go to get food to take home because they're working. Those weren't common back then. You just didn't go to the corner and get food. Like today, your mom runs to the grocery store, Walmart, or goes to, your mom or dad goes to Chick-fil-A or something. That totally makes eating comfortable. Like you got a ready-made meals. Well, that didn't exist. And so this was a tough lady that said that really society should have better changes as far as women being able to work. And of course it does ultimately. Today we have that to some degree, although not for all working women, obviously. So I would definitely be familiar with women in economics. But keep in mind, the major change is not writers at that day, but rather the workforce. So you're going to see a major growth in the workforce, and that's going to change a lot regarding American women as well. Now, I mentioned the role of NALSA, all right, and don't forget the role of the WCTU. Let's make a couple other notes about the ladies here. I feel like this part I must have put on another PowerPoint. I do have a PowerPoint called Her Story. Get it? Not his story, but her story. Her story. History. Not funny. All right. Well, anyway, but I'll go ahead and put it on this one because that's where it should be as well. So let's write down, the role of Wyoming in 1869. Okay. And Wyoming in 1869 is pretty remarkable because it's going to make a bold action, right? Wyoming is going to be the very first state, let's see if I can't find a decent picture of it, to vote for and pass the right to vote for women. So I want to spend a moment talking about that, okay? I want to talk a little bit about that concept because the thing about it is a lot of students aren't aware that all 50 states could give women the right to vote if they wanted to. So what Carrie Catt, remember this lady right here, what she has with Dr. Shaw, Anna Shaw, is a state-by-state goal of getting, because Congress won't even touch this thing. Congress isn't looking at it. And out west, women are sort of ahead because everybody out west is kind of surviving and they're reinventing society and they're like redefining it. So women are owning saloons, women are owning brothels, women are businessmen, women, so entrepreneurs. And so Wyoming they're going to vote a governor out there that's a woman. And so they're way ahead of the rest of the states, but it's slow going. You understand? And so you're going to have a split that occurs in NALSA in the 20th century over a young advocate named Alice Paul, who's going to want an amendment to the Constitution, and Carrie Catt, who's been pushing a state-by-state method, thinking that a national effort is ridiculous. The feds are never going to pass it. So you're going to see that happen in the 20th century, but you definitely should know that the topic of statehood is passed by suffrage is passed by states. So you could have the right to vote in elections at a time when the 19th Amendment wasn't passed. So let's be aware of that. Many states had already ratified in their own state the right to vote for women separate from a national amendment. So that you guys got that, I think, hopefully. So I'll put another picture up to remind you of that. So suffrage was not as easy as just passing the 19th Amendment. That's the guarantee that it would no longer be prohibited. Keep in mind, if Virginia today wanted to say 16-year-olds can vote, then they could. The 18th Amendment says, the 25th Amendment says the right to vote, 26th Amendment, that's what's wrong. The 26th Amendment says the right to vote will not be denied to people over the age of 18 and over. So That means all 50 states have to guarantee suffrage for 18 and older, right? But it's not a prohibition saying that you can't let a 17-year-old vote or 16-year-old. So I think it's interesting that recognize that states guarantee suffrage unless the feds add something to the Congress, to the amendment, the Constitution, as an amendment. Okay, so let's talk about another lady who is, I think, really important for our class, and that is Ida B. Wells. Okay, Ida B. Wells, because we haven't talked about women African Americans very much since before the Civil War. You may recall Sojourner Truth, or perhaps you recall Harriet Tubman. But this lady was remarkable for several reasons. First of all, she was very well educated. She was a suffragette herself. She wanted the right to vote, not just for women, but for Black women, as you might imagine. But her principal concern at the time, her number one really priority, I guess you might say, is the fact of a terrible crime that was so common in the South. And that was something called lynching. So this lady, Ida B. Wells, worked in Nashville, Tennessee, okay? And she was trying to, or not Memphis, Tennessee, not Nashville, I'm sorry, Memphis, Tennessee. And she was trying to raise the communication and the awareness of lynching as a crime in this country. And so I want you to be familiar with her and her crusade, as this textbook says, for justice, because Ida Wells was, and her name was Ida Wells Barnett, or Ida B. Wells, it was usually written. And she was a leading figure that would be a transitional phase to bringing the attention of the ideas of the injustice of lynching. So I definitely want you to know that. Okay. I see what I've done here. My PowerPoint kind of dies out when it gets to these art movements and stuff like that. So I'll kind of make it on the fly with you. I wonder why I left that out. It's in a different chapter section, so to speak. So let's keep going, and I'll record it, and you can take it or leave it. Horatio Alger, looking down at number 36. So we talked about Alger already. Horatio Alger was a fascinating figure who wrote hundreds of novels. Now, they were pretty much formulaic. They pretty much followed the same formula. And what that was that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, this is self-reliance continued. So if you recall the story of self-reliance, the idea that the American individual is a moral, upright, decent person who's struggled against adversity but overcome. And so very, very to put it kind of not critically, kind of like Boy Scout mythos. Okay. Now, it may have existed. I don't want to say it didn't. Keep in mind, the Boy Scouts do wonderful things. They prepare you for, life of self-reliance. Like I said, they teach you. I remember "Be prepared" was the motto, and I learned all kinds of things with guns and with knives and with camping and food preparation. It was great. Learned all kinds of stuff, right? And they taught you moral codes and ethics, and that's kind of what Horatio Alger was like. So he was like the Boy Scout writer for America, if that makes sense. So that kind of that really, I think, the bright American side, the kind of beauty of America. Now, people are going to be critical. People would say, "Well, what about the dark side?" Well, somebody else can write about that. Horatio Alger was kind of like the upbeat, positive narrative of the American. And so scores of boys, particularly, grew up reading Horatio Alger, and that was their idea of the American dream. And so when you saw guys like Joseph Pulitzer, a penniless immigrant, become super successful, right? Or Andrew Carnegie become super successful. Heck, D.L. Moody. Pastor Moody was a poor guy, a really low-income guy who became the most famous pastor in America. So lots of these examples of the self-made person. So I would definitely be familiar with Horatio Alger. Now, I'm not going to talk to you today about Walt Whitman or Dickinson. You can learn those in your English class. I would take a note of Mark Twain. Mark Twain, very important. Probably America's greatest writer in sort of history. If you think about who Mark Twain is in terms of the number of works he creates, the extraordinary diversity that he had. By the way, Mark Twain was good friends with Nikola Tesla. You guys remember Tesla? Tesla once practiced a machine on him to cure his stomach ache, and it worked. Twain poured $300,000 into an investment that did not, a typeset machine that went belly up, which was about $9 million worth of money today. So Twain was very, very wealthy, very successful, and he made his living initially as a riverboat pilot. And his name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, but his works capture there's a term for it, and I guess that's really where we're headed. First of all, he was hilarious in his satire, but at the same time, it captured the gritty realism of life in America, right? So I want you to know Mark Twain for realism, if you don't know that term. And so what he really did, he witnessed Civil War battles. He saw them firsthand. Later in life, he became somewhat cynical of America, I think. But nonetheless, he's the guy who coined the term Gilded Age. And definitely know his two most famous works, which are Tom Sawyer, and then years later he wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Those two books are American classics. Bret Hart, he wrote cowboy books. They were really popular. Wyatt's Help. Stephen Crane, you guys heard of Red Badge of Courage? So at very least, I would like you to be familiar with what the naturalists were writing about and the realists were writing about. Now, I personally can't stand the writings of Henry James. Henry James is an American author who's the brother of William James, the philosopher. His books make for really British-feeling American stories. All right. So in other words, they're written in a style that seems Victorian English, and they're about interesting characters, but they're a lot about their love stories and Portrait of a Lady and Wings of a Dove. These are novels where they're talking about women and their relationship with men, which is great. I'm sure that the type of people like that. I just wasn't one of them. So it's not romance novels. Don't think of them as that. They're great works of literature, but they're written about the relationships between men and women, particularly in a romantic setting. Naturalism, I mentioned Stephen Crane. And so for him, he's going to write about things like battlefield honesty. So you guys read The Red Badge of Courage? You know what it is? So a red badge of courage is a wound from battle. And in his story, The Red Badge of Courage, the protagonist doesn't get wounded, actually runs away, and then stabs himself to make himself seem like he got hurt. So was he that brave? So it's sort of talking about human nature and some of the flaws of humanity and things like that. So very naturalistic, interesting book or story. But I would like you to make note of Jack London, not just because he was my favorite novelist as a kid, but he was. I love The Call of the Wild. Grew up loving outdoors and loving the idea of a dog that is kidnapped or dog-napped and taken up to Alaska for the gold rush, and then goes back to nature and becomes a true animal again. But anyway, he and another guy named Frank Norris were basically socialists. They were critical of life in the West. So yet again, you see even novelists during this period were openly unhappy with the things that were wrong in our country. I've already mentioned Theodore Dreiser. So you're going to have a lot of that going on in America, where writers are critical of the dark side of our country. Charles Dickens was doing that over in Britain. He was writing about the nastiness of the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of the writing from this period is kind of not read as much now. But I don't know what y'all read in your American English class, American Lit classes, but maybe you'll learn more about it. So let's move on to a couple of artists. I really only need you to know two artists from this period, visual artists. One of those is actually three. I have three. Oh, I have four up here, but I don't think Sargent is usually going to show up on anything. But I'm going to give you these three to know, certainly, and maybe if you want to write down Singer Sargent's character, like most famous work, you can. But what these guys and ladies did was they were creating an art form that was still somewhat derivative. So if the last time we were talking about visual art, we were looking at the Luminists and the Hudson River School. You guys remember the Hudson River School, the big landscapes, and the guys painting Indians. So these folks are interesting because they're still studying Europeans. In fact, a lot of these were people who went to Europe and did their work there. But the few that I want you to know is this one, which is very famous. It's got an arrangement in gray and black, number one, but really we all know it as Whistler's Mother. So have you ever seen the lady sitting in the chair with black? Whistler's mother, they call it. So be familiar with that. At the very least, just be educated. Be familiar with Wenzel Homer, who painted seascapes. So this one's great. It's this fella is down in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico rather, and he's got these sharks all around him, but lots of waves and seascapes. So Wenzel Homer, very famous regional artist for that period. And then lastly, both these artists were very influenced by the Europeans. But the one I want you to know about Mary Cassatt was she worked with a guy named Claude Monet. And so she was America's really greatest and only famous impressionist. So I know you guys probably don't know impressionist art that much, Monet, Manet, those guys. But Mary Cassatt was an American painter who painted like the Parisian painters in France. She studied with them and learned their style. And so if you're in a museum and you see an American impressionist painting, it's probably Mary Cassatt. She was one of the few who used that style. I don't want to teach you what impressionism is, but still, when it comes to American art during this period, not really the most famous. It's more like Americans going to Europe, making art of America that's European influenced. So I'll leave it at that. Now, as you're reading, and I'll have to update my PowerPoint a little bit, but you're both newer here. Do know the term City Beautiful. This is the period in American history where you're going to start seeing electric lights changing the nature of streets and the creation of parks in cities. So if you think about it, the park is a great contribution to the ordinary people, to the ordinary common American, because if you're a wealthy individual, you can basically own a park. You can have your own park at your house, so to speak. But if you were a poor urban worker, you didn't know what nature looked like. You were so far away from nature. And so think about things like the building of Central Park, And of course, architecture during this period is very big, very grand, very grandiose. But I would say be familiar with the City Beautiful movement. And several of the videos that I share on the YouTube channel talk about the Columbian Exposition of 1893, which was in Chicago. So back then they had these world fairs, and they called them Columbian Expositions. So Chicago, remember the fire 22 years before, had been completely rebuilt and was a modern, beautiful city. And they built this huge fair, and millions of people came. I mean, tens of millions of people came to it. The book says 27 million people, which was about 40% of the entire nation, came to this exposition. And that's where a lot of the very people that we've been talking about in this chapter actually were in person. They went there in person. Theodore Dreiser was there during this. D.L. Moody was preaching during this. So lots of this going on. So definitely be aware of that. And then the last little section here is on amusement, which is interesting. I don't have it in here, but I should add it. There's several key amusement games and things like that were being played. Probably the largest source of amusement really was going to church revivals. But the second largest thing, probably of the time, was a guy who had bought a building in New York City that had sort of a collection of, sort of bizarre and strange things. And that guy right there, his name is P.T. Barnum. And so he went on the road, and you had the first really famous American circus, right? So this is where the P.T. Barnum circus would come. And you had all kinds of, once it was Barnum and Bailey, really interesting looking oddities. And so people would go to the circus. Another really popular pastime at this time in history was the Wild West show. So this fella, who will later get shot in the back out in Deadwood, he had a show where he would bring all kinds of famous Western cowboys. Right now, this guy wasn't the one who got shot, but this is an example of one of the signs for it. Now, the guy that got shot's name was Wild Bill Hickok, but he rode around with Buffalo Bill Cody and a retired Indian chief named Sitting Bull. All right. And so people would go Annie Oakley to see her shoot out, playing cards at 100 yards and stuff like that. So really, this was a lot of fun going to Buffalo Bill Cody and Wild Bill Hickok's show. The book talks about also in Massachusetts that year, the invention of basketball. So you actually now began to have, for the first time in American history, baseball games that were regular. Now, keep in mind, baseball actually predates the Civil War. So baseball created its first major league in the 1870s, So you could go back and get flyers. Here's one from one of my favorite teams, the Washington Senators. All right. So back before the Nationals existed. So you had baseball teams. You can see they look pretty rough and tumble. You had James Naismith, who invented a sport for the YMCA, which was basketball, and he is in the Basketball Hall. In fact, the Basketball Hall of Fame is named after him, I think. This is James Naismith. So you think about how much basketball and baseball have changed over the years. Football was a club sport and a college team sport. It hadn't fully grown into major league. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to show you in sort of closing here is, I should have put it here, is where you're going to have a sort of synergy between both a beautiful entertainment form and a tragic entertainment form. So during this period, you had the emergence of stage performances that were often quite elaborate. They would be, dancers, musicians, singers, big leg sweeps, and this is what was called vaudeville, right? So vaudeville was sort of the first kind of pop music. You could get records from Edison of classical music, you could get Mozart and Haydn, those guys, but this was live music performed on stage that you would go and see. But unfortunately, within vaudeville also emerged an element of it that is completely, no longer appropriate. And it was a show where individuals would perform as white people would perform as African Americans. And they would mimic African American music. Okay. And the name of one of these caricatures, and that's what they are, they're called caricatures, was Jim Crow. And so during this period, Jim Crow, which was a stage performance, basically, ended up becoming adopted by white performers as what is sometimes now called as well the minstrel show. Okay. And so the minstrel show is sort of a performance of white people. Well, it could be black people performing. So a minstrel show could be an African American singing, but typically it would involve a white person in what is called blackface. So very racist, very derogatory, but at the same time, it was interesting because the music that was being performed was a imitation of the music that black people sang and performed. So rather than just be a white person performing music that black people did, think Elvis, all right? These were white people pretending to dress and be like black people performing this music. So, of course, today, blackface is a sign of derogatory and bigotry. You're not supposed to do this. Apparently, a lot of people didn't get the memo 50 years ago. They dressed in blackface all the time. But nonetheless, this was very ugly and relatively common. And so I would definitely be familiar with both Jim Crow and the idea of the minstrel show, but also with vaudeville. And so I don't want to equate those two as synonyms. Some vaudeville performances would include a minstrel show, which would be a way of bringing Stephen Foster's music to the or to the population or things like that. But at the same time, it definitely had elements of overt racism. So I'll stop with that today. I know I had to revise a few of those, update it, and I apologize for that. But hopefully that makes sense now. And y'all have a good day. I will post the quiz for you to have for tomorrow. Okay. And y'all take care. Unless you have a question, you can ask me a question. I'll be here for a bit. I just have to find me.